So thank you so much to the organizers for having me here. I'm actually really amazed at the setup that you guys have done. I'm really excited to be here today to tell you guys about some of the fascinating findings that we've been gathering through our work, discovering through our work on this massively defining event that happened in 1947 that created India and Pakistan and I guess Bangladesh now as well. So a lot of you guys, I'm hoping everyone in here has heard about partition in 1947, and probably most of you had heard about the communal violence that occurred at that time. And a lot of people actually, when I talk to them around the world outside of Punjab and Bengal, they often have not heard about partition. So let me just go into my next slide. They often have not heard about partition, or when they talk about partition, they talk about this first point that I have here. They think that what actually happened in 1947 was that people kind of went mad. They kind of just, as the Radcliffe Line was announced, India and Pakistan separated, and people just started killing each other. Hindus and Muslims started killing each other. Neighbors turned on neighbors, and it was this wild, sort of violent frenzy. And growing up, having had my family in Ground Zero in Lahore, they migrated to India from Lahore. It always sounded like a very perplexing issue to me. How do people, say all of us in this room together today, if somebody were to announce some sort of division, would we just start killing each other? Is that what would happen? It sounded really kind of bizarre to me. What I'm excited to tell you today is that what our findings from oral history tell us, that that's not exactly what happened. In fact, people didn't really even go crazy, and we could go so far as saying that maybe they were behaving perfectly normally, given their circumstances at that time. So I want to talk about that. So the second rhetoric that I often hear is that partition is over and done. It's something that happened in 1947. It's not something that we need to be worried about today. That's another myth that I hope will end, and that we will go back to this time and look at it deeper, because partition continues to inform us in so many ways. It informs our politics. It informs our economic policies. It informs our trade. It informs our military budget that's still going on to this day. And in fact, it even brought global superpowers. When there was a vacuum left by the British, it brought Russia and the US to this region. So it still continues to be significant in many ways, and we live that significance without even knowing how it's affecting us. So let's put these myths to rest for good. So now I want to get into some lines and numbers. This map is from 1946. It's Wikimedia Commons. You can see it online if you like, and go study it a little bit more. It's from Columbia University. The white regions here are native Indian states, as you can see listed here. And the gray region, that's British India. Now, one thing we forget is that India is actually not a native term. It's not from here. It's a word derived from Greek and English language. And there's a whole other history that you can go on into that. It comes from the name of the Indus River. But I won't get into that today. What I'm going to get into is the fact that when you start talking to people, and when you look at oral history, what becomes significant is that you learn that people who are living in these white areas, for them, becoming a part of a new big India and Pakistan was a brand new thing, because they were used to these local empires and regions before that. Their identities were attached to those kingdoms that they were in. So now let's look at the numbers. I haven't gone into the Radcliffe Line in my last picture, but you can kind of see that it was somewhat drawn over here. It's not drawn up here, but over here the Radcliffe Line was drawn. And what happened at that time is estimates show from 1946 to 1948, about 14.5 to 15 million people, that's a generally agreed upon figure, migrated. That's kind of crazy if you think about it. And over the next 10 years, over 20,000 people migrated, according to research. And that leads us to, if you look at the world population at that time, that's about 1% of the world's population. In today's language, that would be around 70 million people, and that's the total number of refugees, actually, that we have in the world today. Number of lives lost at the time of partition, these estimates vary widely as well. So I've seen, if you go to Wikipedia, you'll see numbers that are around 500,000. But if you look at some latest research that's coming out, you'll see numbers as high as 3 million. So we don't really know, because people actually, even after partition, there was a lot of people living in refugee camps, there was a lot of people living in not so great conditions, hygienically and so on. There was a lot of people who also had a lot of psychological trauma. So they may not have died during the violence of partition, but in the aftermath also there were a lot of deaths that need to be accounted for. I read somewhere that there were about 3.5 million people in the 1951 census that were unaccounted for. So we don't know what happened to them. And then there's the number of abductions. Over 100,000 women estimated to have been abducted, and we don't even know how many children were orphaned and abducted. From our oral history, we know that it was probably a significant number because we've met a lot of those children. This is just a scene from that time, so you can see what it looked like when people were migrating. So how do you make sense of the violence at that time? Let's explore. So just to give you a glimpse of what we're doing, we record oral history, but we do it in a little bit of a different way. We crowdsource it. So we empower everyone, everywhere, to go out in their communities and record the stories. We provide the basic framework and the basic training. And what this enables is, it empowers people everywhere, and from many different communities, especially those that were underrepresented in the general narrative, to go out in their communities, record the stories. And then what happens for the rest of us in the world is we learn about partition and how diverse the experiences of partition were. It's not just this one narrative that you might have heard, if you heard about it, through your textbooks. So another cool thing that happens when you start doing it this crowdsourced way, the oral histories, so if there's 100 people recording the oral histories, or 500 people in our case, there's over 500 volunteers that have contributed to the partition archive, they've gone ahead and they've talked about these stories that they're hearing with their friends and family. So the people that are hearing about it organically then increases to the thousands. And then what else happens is as we post them on social media and as they tell even more friends and family, eventually this number, especially if you get, say, somebody who's in film or an author who gets interested, these numbers then go up into the millions. So this history slowly spreads in a grassroots way. That's another benefit of doing it in the crowdsourced manner. So we actually see direct measurable impacts from crowdsourcing this and the change that we have in our general overall public narrative. I'm not going to go into that today, but you can actually do some analysis on Google, and it's quite fascinating. Another thing that crowdsourcing and oral history does for us is gives us a deeper understanding of that time period, and it also busts a lot of communal myths that we have. And I'll talk about what I mean in a second. So just to give you a glimpse of what a typical oral history session could look like, this photo is from the northwest frontier area in Pakistan, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and this is in Swat district. So let's talk about the violence during partition. Could it have been predictable? In the context of modern economic theory, we can say that yes, if you actually look at the conditions of that time, it indeed could have been predictable. And that I found very interesting. So what happened is, so I'm not an economist, just to give you guys a little bit of a disclaimer. I'm actually a physicist by training, and I think a lot of you guys are engineers, so you probably relate to that. But I do have training in formal research, and my instinct as a physicist is to look at nature and things that are happening, to find patterns, and to assign numbers to those patterns. I like predictability, right? And I know that in behavioral economics, you can't really predict 100% of the time, but it does still fascinate me. So and economics is also important because when you start to contextualize partition in terms of economics, you start to look at it in terms of the losses, the financial losses that occurred at that time, not just to individuals, but to an entire people. And that's the language of politics and power and governance in our modern day. That's what moves things. So if we put things into that context, we can kind of see how deeply it impacted all of us. And that's another thing I really like about it. And then another thing I like about it is the prediction. It's the ability to predict communal violence in the future. So if we understand the conditions that will cause it, we could hopefully in the future see it coming and do an intervention. So oral history points us in the right direction. So there's a lot of, if you look at economic theory textbooks and articles, you'll find a lot of equations and so on, but oral history can sometimes push you in the direction of one theory or another, and so on. Just to throw out another picture of an oral history taking place, this is in Malerkotla in Punjab by one of our volunteers, Rupinder Kaur, and I'll talk about this in a moment. So here's what we've learned. So when we talk to victims, people who've been attacked at the time of partition, they tell us that unlike this common rhetoric of neighbors killing neighbors, they actually, in most cases, or at least all cases that I've personally come across, in most cases, people did not know their attackers. So the archive currently has over 7,500 oral histories. Obviously, I have not looked at all of them, but they did not know who their attackers were. So people were not killing people that they knew. In the countryside, we hear over and over again that usually the mobs that were attacking, people did not know who these mobs were. They were not people who lived in the same village necessarily. Sometimes that happened. Sometimes there was this tendency to try to settle old scores, if you will. But most of the time, people were attacking a couple of villages away. So there was no it was not like a vengeance, like a personal vengeance. It was impersonal. In the cities, once again, we find that neighbors were not necessarily attacking neighbors. In cities like Amritsar and Delhi and Calcutta, you see that you had mahallas. You had the Muslim mahalla, you had the Hindu mahalla, and Sikhs. They were people were somewhat segregated in the middle and lower income groups. It was the very rich people who were kind of more mixed. And in those areas, you see that people were getting attacked by people of a different mahalla, so it was not necessarily neighbors attacking neighbors. And very rarely we see that people use this time of lawlessness to settle, old grievances that they had, maybe with a neighbor in that case. And something interesting that I heard from one of the people that I interviewed, he said, look, 90% of us were just behaving like normal people. We were not doing anything. It was 2 to 3% of people who committed most of the violence. And so I thought that was a really interesting statement, which oral history, one of the things it does, it inspires you to dig deeper into ideas that you may not have otherwise had. And what happens when we interview perpetrators of violence? So I just talked about interviewing victims. When you interview perpetrators of violence, we find that the primary motivation for a lot of people was the promise of loot, the promise of getting things, getting money, getting property. And the second motivation was women, and I thought that was really interesting. And the more you learn about it, this is a whole talk on itself, but it seems like women were objectified at that time a little bit, and it's a little bit similar to the first category. And it wasn't just that. It wasn't just the promises of these two items that led people to violence. It was also a lot of rhetoric by local politicians. So local politicians were taking the leadership in igniting groups of young boys to go and commit violence. Sometimes refugees came in. People didn't know where to settle them. The politicians didn't know where to settle them. And it was beneficial for them under this new democracy to have a constituency that was favorable to them. So then they would ignite people to commit violence against certain areas where they wanted the houses to become empty. So where were the authorities at this time? Well, one of the interesting things we're finding, and maybe it seems obvious, but at this time when people were getting divided based along communal lines, the police and military, there was a lot of confusion in the ranks. So if you're an officer, say you're a Muslim police officer, and you see a Muslim man attacking a Hindu man, now who are you going to protect? Are you going to go with what you're supposed to be doing and protect the victim, or are you going to go with what this new rhetoric, this new political rhetoric around you, are you going to follow that? So there was a lot of confusion in the ranks, and we hear from people that the violence suddenly stops when militaries like the Gorkhas and militaries from Madras show up, who are ethnically unrelated to Punjabis and Bengalis. And what this tells us, so I guess the question we want to ask is, were the people mad? The verdict from oral histories is no. In fact, the violence is predictable and also rational in such a circumstance. That's what we're finding That's what you get if you look at economic behavioral theory. This is normal human behavior that's not related to skin color, so you can't say like, oh, okay, this is just, these people living here in this area, they behave badly, they're uneducated or something like that. That was not the case at all. It's also unrelated to ethnicity. In fact, it's related to politics and to economy. I think I may have accidentally skipped a slide here, maybe not, okay. There's the economic theory slide I was looking for. So I started to dig into this. I started to talk to some of our team members, and some of them who are doing PhDs actually in behavioral economics, in war, and so on. And they're looking at behaviors of people in these types of situations. So one of them, Kamaldeep, he sent me a bunch of papers. Now, I'm not an expert, like I said, but why I wanted to put these ideas out, despite not being an expert, is to ignite people to do further research on it. What I found was that there's a thing called horizontal inequalities. So there's a theory that violence is not necessarily ignited if you've got economic disparities between people, individual people, so a rich person and a poor person. But if you have groups that are segregated by, it could be anything, it could be ethnicity, it could be religion. In this case in South Asia, it was religion, it could be caste even. But when you have groups that are segregated and one group is economically depressed compared to the other. And in addition, if that group does not have political representation and they don't feel involved in the local economy, that is sort of a prime, I guess, formula for violence. They've seen this around the world, and in terms of partition, we can relate, because in Ambala and Firozpur, for example, or you can look at Sindh, Hyderabad in Sindh, you see that in Ambala and Firozpur, the wealthier groups were the Muslims. You had Muslim Nawabs and you had Muslim landlords. And the example I chose here, Hyderabad in Sindh, the landowners tended to be Hindu, and these were the people that were driven out and their properties were taken over. And then you have places like Malerkotla in Punjab, where there was no violence at the time of partition. It still has a sizable, very sort of cosmopolitan mixed population of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs living there to this day, and they have not seen any of these religious rioting. And a lot of that has to do with their local political leadership. That political rhetoric was missing. So it's fascinating because we can actually use existing economic theory to look at partition and even all of the continuing riots that are going on in India, and I hope that that's what happens. So another interesting theory, and this definitely played a role in partition, was soldiers, when they return from war, and if they're not properly resettled after, say, 5 to 10 years of being away in a conflict zone, so these are people who are armed. They're now somewhat traumatized, and there's a whole lot of psychological factors that go into that that I'm not necessarily an expert on. But at least the theory says that when soldiers come back and they're not properly rehabilitated in their communities, that creates sort of a prime environment for communal unrest. You saw this in Rwanda in 1994, very famous, the Rondon Genocide. That was again in 1993. You had a lot of soldiers that came back. You see this in 1997 in Sierra Leone. And you see this in 2003 in Iraq, when the US suddenly sort of gave power back to the people, disarmed the soldiers, and they go back into their communities, and you see a lot of civil unrest. At the time of partition, World War II, a lot of soldiers, especially from Punjab who were in World War II, when they came back, they were just kind of like said, okay, here you go. You're back in Punjab. And those are the guys that were involved in a lot of the violence that occurred in Punjab at the time of partition. And that's why Punjab did have a lot more of the violence. Now here's another really interesting example of how oral history shines light in a way that no other source can. This is an example of self-organized caravans. So I read an article about these caravans that were 20, 30 miles long, that were 20, 30 kilometers long, sorry, that were organized by former British soldiers going from West Punjab to East Punjab. And they specifically went to certain cities like Hoshiarpur, Gurdaspur, Jalandhar. Oral history tells us something very interesting. So in 1857, when there was that mutiny, actually before that, there was a lot of soldiers from Maharaja Ranjit Singh's army in Punjab that joined the British military at that time. And in response, they were given land in West Punjab. That was sort of a token for their service. And at the time of partition, what happened is they chose those same people from these areas, went back to the cities and the regions that they were originally from. And so oral history provides new insights into some of these interesting facts that people are seeing and patterns. So why does it all matter today? I think if we can identify the conditions for violence, if we can predict communal violence before it occurs, we may be able to provide some interventions, like in the rioting that continues to occur to this day in South Asia. There's increasing political polarization today around the world. We even see it in the US. And that creates sort of a prime condition for having communal violence. So how can we prevent that? Global climate change, as our oral histories are showing us, is another possible condition for increased human conflict in the future because resources are going to be affected by climate change. And so how are we going to deal with the increase in human violence? And I think it is going to increase. We're seeing it in the Sundarbans already. And I leave you guys with one last thing. So what can you do in the future to help avoid communal violence? So you can look at the economic and political inclusion in your communities. Be wary of political leaders who use words to ignite violence. And you can ask yourself, are you listening to the minorities in your community? Is the government listening to everybody in your community? So I leave you guys with that. Thank you so much for having me today. Thank you.